Colonel Hamilton Fish. His office is on the far side of the lobby, a downtown Manhattan hotel. Once upon a time, it may have been a deluxe many years ago. Elderly people, a few, are seated in this bleak anteroom. Inside the office, it is cramped with mementos of better days. A bust of Alexander Hamilton, the face of Lincoln, autographed photographs of Warren Gamaliel Harding, Calvin Coolidge, General Douglas MacArthur, and Senator Everett McKinley Dirksen, and the adjacent bookshelf on which are sprawled numerous works dealing with military matters, a photograph of himself, a bareheaded young football player, Harvard '08, Walter Camp's choice as all-time All-American tackle. The colonel, tall, lean, remarkably vigorous for his years, crosses his legs. His eyes half closed, he appears to be addressing multitudes. The first bill I introduced in Congress was in December 1920. It was a bill to bring back the body of the unknown soldier. It was signed by Woodrow Wilson, the last piece of legislation he signed. That's almost 50 years ago. There were at least 50,000 people there. As a World War I vet, did you have any thoughts concerning the bonus March of 32? I was always for the veteran. Veterans elected me. Those young fellows in those days knew how to fight. I wasn't connected at all with the bonus march. It was ill-advised and caused a political issue, which it never should have. I was for a bonus certificate. I wasn't for these handouts. There were extremists on this bonus march. They loved to be in the march. They got a whole lot of extremists down there, and they caused trouble. I kept away from it. I was chairman of the first committee to investigate communist activity in the United States. It was known as the Fish Community. It only lasted 1 year, from 30 to 31. We didn't go after personalities. We didn't send people to jail or anything like that. Congress can't send people to jail anyhow. We did go after their organizations, to warn the American people. It was educational. We had only $25,000 to make the investigation. Now they give them $300,000 or $400,000. We didn't even need the $25,000 because the 4 other members were also lawyers. Our $25,000 included traveling expenses, and so on. I think I'm the first member of Congress, and perhaps the only member of Congress, that ever returned any fund allotted to committees. I returned $5,000. I'm sorry I did it now, because I would have liked to use the whole amount to have our report printed by the hundreds of thousands. HR 2290 is still the best report, it's only about 60 pages, is still the best report on communism in America. I wrote and got through a bill creating the Un-American Activities Committee, which came a few years later, chairmaned by Mr. Dies of Texas. I have a letter from him. It's interesting, because congressmen are prima donnas. They like to claim credit for everything for themselves, that he was responsible for the investigation of communists and so on. But, in fairness to Dies, he was certainly not, in this case, a prima donna, because he sent me this letter unsolicited in '62 from Texas. In a ringing voice, he reads the letter. Tribute is paid him for his pioneering efforts and the information he provided Dies. All records which our government had seized had mysteriously disappeared. I was able to get invaluable help from the work you did. What did Congressman Dies mean about the files disappearing? What he said was the files were destroyed under orders from Roosevelt. I don't claim Roosevelt was a communist. I don't even say he was pro-communist. He was a socialist. He said, "Some of my best friends are communists." Imagine the President of the United States saying that, and then going over and selling out to Stalin. What I wanted to do was to encourage Hitler to fight Stalin. Let them fight it out, and let the free nations sit on the sidelines, just egging them on and saying, "A plague on both your houses." Dies did a very good job. Why do you think we have so little communism in America today? Actually, it's less than 1% communism in America. With fellow travelers, it's a little more, with extremists and others. Now, why is this a fact? Because the Un-American Activity Committee, American Labor took it up, the American Legion took it up, all the patriotic groups. If it hadn't been for that, you'd have had 10% communists. We'd all have hell to pay in this country here today. We've got enough troubles already. After Dies came McCarthy, maligned, practically crucified, and almost killed. He was hated because he was so fearless. He's still hated because they tortured the truth about him. Whether he'll ever get credit, I don't know. Although McCarthy is probably our most hated man in recent history, he always had the majority of the people with him, from Cardinal Spellman down. They spent millions to destroy this man. They destroyed him by putting through that censure resolution in the Senate. I'd like to have been at the Senate at that time, because I've always been able to talk. I'd have been giving him hell. They killed him, you know, they killed him. They began to gang up on me first, then they ganged up on Dies, and they ganged up on McCarthy 100-fold. What they didn't do to him was a shame. Franklin Delano Roosevelt. I represented, of course, the district which he came from, Hyde Park, Dutchess County. I represented it in Congress for 25 years. 10 years before he was elected president, until the next 15 years, until he practically died. I was never beaten in that district. Roosevelt did his best every time to defeat me in Congress. He spent a great deal of money with the columnists and the radio commentators. He would rather defeat me, I think, almost, than be elected himself. It developed on his part a good deal of bitterness, because I criticized him openly. Never personally himself. I always denied he was a communist or pro-communist and so on. I'd say, perhaps he is a socialist, but if he wants to be one, he has a right to be one. He became bitterer and bitterer. He really began to hate me. I had nothing against him. I don't belong to that school of Republican that go around calling names, a lot of bad names. I fought him above board, and I am not sorry. I'm sorry I didn't fight him harder than I did, because he did a great deal of harm to this country. It will take us many, maybe 100 years to live it down. It was very amusing. He'd send in must legislation, some radical measure. I'd get up, I got along pretty well with the Democrats. I'd offer an amendment to the bill which would really destroy it, and it carried. He'd have his leaders up there the next day. "What's the matter with you people here? What's the trouble?" And they'd say, "Mr. President, that's your own congressman that offered that amendment." They say he almost had apoplexy, almost died. And they'd come back to me, all these Democratic leaders, I knew them well, and laughing, saying, "You almost killed the president. He was trying to put the blame on us, and we put it on you." They'd say he nearly dropped on the spot. This happened a half a dozen times, not once. I was on the radio at least 10 or 15 times a year, on the big radios. That's what hurt him, because I'd accuse him. I accuse the president of this, of that, down the line. It infuriated him. Roosevelt never went out of his way to attack me personally. He did talk about Martin, Barton, and Fish, and inferred we were reactionaries. That isn't correct. I had voted for Social Security and the most progressive legislation. I always have the support of the American Federation of Labor. On social justice, I was left of center. He hired a columnist to attack me. Some of them absolutely slammed me, maliciously lied about me. Members of his cabinet, like Ikes, the Secretary of Interior, were taking cracks at me. I naturally answered them. I spoke about Messrs. Jackson, Ikes, Roosevelt. I called them 3 blind readers. 3 blind readers, see how they run. They ran into a depression which they claim is mere recession. Did you ever hear such deception by 3 blind readers? See how they run, see how they squirm, see how they alibi those 3 blind leaders. When he first ran for president, I was very friendly with him. He ran on a very fine middle-of-the-road, or rather conservative, platform. Perhaps the most conservative platform in history. My wife voted for him. I supported Hoover. They asked me if I would take my keynote speech down to Washington and show it to President Hoover. He read it and approved it, all except the provision about the liquor amendment. I had to put a paragraph in favor of light wine and beer. I'm afraid that his wife, who was a white ribboner and a complete prohibitionist, opposed that. He brought it back the next morning and he said, "You'll have to delete that light wine and beer suggestion because I can't approve it." That changed the whole election. Just that one thing. And, of course, the Depression. People were unemployed, and they were blaming Hoover. But certainly it would have brought him millions of votes. He lost by maybe 10 million, and he would have halved it. That would have made a great deal of difference. But it would not have elected Hoover, because they absolutely sabotaged his constructive programs. It would have softened the Depression and would have solved the Depression. They sabotaged that deliberately, the Democrats in Congress. Roosevelt was in on it. He wouldn't even confer with Hoover at the time. They wanted to continue this Depression so they could sweep the country. They wanted people unemployed so they could reap the whirlwind of votes. It was shameful. As soon as Roosevelt got in, he changed. He trampled his platform, brought into Washington a whole lot of young, socialistic, radical brain trusters who sought to change the whole ideology of the United States. He had become, finally, an extremist. During the first 100 days, I did vote for practically every recommendation made by Roosevelt. The real break between me and my constituent was on the recognition of Soviet Russia. He recognized Soviet Russia without any support whatsoever in Congress. All former presidents, everybody, was against recognizing Soviet Russia at that time. But he went ahead and did it by himself. Up to then, we had been on very friendly relations. He okayed a stamp for me, and Jim Farley, who was a friend of mine, and has been ever since, put the stamp through. I had letters from Roosevelt thanking me. I broke with him, and began to be one of the leaders of opposition to the socialism of the New Deal and this big spending. There were 10 million people unemployed all the time during the New Deal. That history has not been brought out clearly. Most of your historians of that period were New Dealers on the payroll. He had $100 million to spend without making an account. He gave large sums of money to his friends, who were writers and authors. Everything pro-deal were written and almost nothing against it. It's changed a little bit since then. Warming to his favorite subject, he speaks of Roosevelt determined on a pro-war policy. In the 1940 campaign, he made a pledge to mothers and fathers that their sons would not be sent to fight in any foreign wars. It was absolutely a dishonest, dishonorable, contemptible statement, because he had been planning to get us in all the time. The Germans didn't want us fighting him. fighting them, so they disregarded 20 or 30 attempts that we made to fight, attacking their submarines, bombing their submarines, giving away destroyers to England. When he found he couldn't get Germany to fight us, he turned and tried to get Japan into the war. There were 3 reasons Roosevelt wanted war. 1, you had 10 million Americans unemployed after 6 years of the New Deal. The other one, to be a war president, you became a great man overnight. And then he hoped to put through a United Nations, of which he would be the author and the uncrowned ruler of the world. With his dreams, I could speak at length, but that's another matter. Roosevelt would have gone down in history as a great president after his first 2 terms, but he made a mistake going for the 3rd term. Jim Farley and all the rest fought it. His tragic mistake was when he was a sick and dying man, caved in, mentally and physically, and he insisted on a 4th term. I'm the indispensable man. All that bunk. He had all this radical, fanatical legislation introduced. They were not based on American customs. They were all socialistic, and socialism always fails. I know as much about it as anybody, because I debated Norman Thomas, whom I have a very high idea of, at least 10 different times. Of course, socialism has tremendous ideals. If everybody was an angel, socialism would be wonderful. If everybody worked for everybody else, and for themselves, and for the country, it might work. But it has never worked in any big country. Maybe a small country of 5 million. I'm for the right of everybody to speak. Democrats, Republicans, left, right, extremists, freedom people, so on. The only thing communism fears is the word freedom. And they fear that like the devil is feared by Christians. H.R. 2290 was the best report ever written on communism. I'm only sorry I didn't keep that $5,000 and spend it to print 1 million copies. Postscript. Al Smith was a very dear friend of mine. He loved this country and he hated communism. I was asked by Republican leaders if I would go down and see Al Smith at the Empire State Building, and ask if he would run on the Republican ticket for the United States Senator against his old friend, Robert Wagner. It was shortly before Al's death. Much to my surprise, he said, "You know, Ham, I'd like to run and beat Wagner. I would like to go to Washington, and as a senator, get up and oppose all the New Deal socialistic legislation and ridicule it, and I can do it." It was a matter of Smith's failing health, apparently, that kept him from making the race. And he said, "My heart is not as strong as it should be. And I have a very good job here, $50,000. Well, I said, Al, as far as the job is concerned, we've been in touch with Mr. Dupont, who pays the salary, and he will continue the salary regardless. The colonel withdrew the request, because I, too, believed he could be elected, but not at the expense of his life.